Imagine the final evening of a journey of a lifetime. The percussion is thunderous. The atmosphere in Indonesia is heavy with the aroma of tropical precipitation. And you are 19 years old with the entire planet at your feet. For Ashley King, August 30th, 2011, was destined to be a triumphant finale to a year of post-graduation exploration. She was youthful, self-assured, and positioned in a high-end lounge in the Kuta district, clutching a beverage engineered for the dance floor. It was a nectar-like vodka infusion served in a reusable plastic vessel. A simple convenience so she could oscillate to the rhythm without spilling a drop. But inside that polymer container, a chemical sequence was already waiting to dismantle her reality. Within 48 hours, her physiology would initiate a descent into systemic organ failure, culminating in the permanent neurological erasure of her visual cortex. The staggering reality of Indonesia is that a single, luxurious refreshment can transform the human frame into a chemical sarcophagus. We are investigating the mechanics of an inconspicuous toxin and the psychological fortitude required to reconstruct an existence from a mere 2% of a vantage point. What was actually contained within that innocuous party favor? Why did the manifestations wait until she was thousands of leagues away in another sovereignty to strike? And how did consuming additional spirits become the solitary clinical path to remaining alive? As the neon glow of Kuta dissolved into the night, Ashley had no way of knowing that her existence was about to fade into a permanent amber-tinted blur. August 30th, 2011. Kuta. The district is a sensory bombardment of globetrotters, motorbikes, and the humid saline air of the Indian Ocean. Ashley King and her closest companion, Krista, were commemorating the conclusion of a year-long odyssey that had transported them across the map. They hailed from Calgary, and this was their final celebration before departing for distinct corners of the globe. Their intent had been to traverse the tranquil reaches of the province, but destiny held alternative designs. Ashley's credit cards had been pilfered, and Krista's resources were dwindling. They were stranded in Kuta, the island's thumping festive marrow, enduring their final hours. In one of the more prestigious establishments on the Strip, the ambiance felt secure. This wasn't a roadside kiosk or a shadowy corridor. It was a refined venue. Ashley was handed a sugary vodka concoction. The reusable plastic flask felt functional. She danced. She imbibed. She was, by her own recollection, intoxicated, but not exceptionally so. It was a standard night in a tourist hub. The following morning yielded the anticipated hangover, a dull throb that felt like an equitable exchange for the experiences garnered. At midnight, the two associates progressed toward the terminal. Ashley was destined for New Zealand to witness the Rugby World Cup, while Krista departed for Australia. They embraced in farewell, oblivious that the iteration of Ashley that boarded that aircraft would never truly return. The initial red flag manifested at Christchurch immigration. As Ashley stood before the border authorities, the surroundings began to oscillate. She hadn't yet reserved her return aviation, a frequent lapse for a teenage wanderer. But the cross-examination felt exceptionally grueling. She realized she couldn't articulate coherent phrases. Her articulation was labored. She sounded inebriated, even though her final glass had been nearly 20 hours prior. The customs officer regarded her with skepticism. But Ashley was unaware that her cerebellum was already beginning to immerse in formaldehyde. She dismissed the slurred phonetics as exhaustion. There had been a protracted intermission before her 6-hour flight from Kuta to Sydney, followed by another segment to New Zealand. Her luggage had been misplaced by the carrier. She was isolated, agitated, and down to her final $15. She hypothesized her constitution was simply fracturing under the burden of travel lethargy. She contacted her mother in Calgary, who promptly purchased a return ticket to Brisbane just to satisfy the immigration officials. Ashley felt queasy and disoriented as she piloted her way through the concourse. She possessed no cellular device, only an iPod Touch. She attributed her state to anxiety. She blamed the vanished trunks. She blamed the humidity of the tropics. But as she stepped into the frigid New Zealand atmosphere, the weight of the stillness began to feel like a physical constriction against her temples. Ashley reached her Christchurch hostel at 4 p.m. The lethargy was absolute. She retreated to bed and descended into a heavy slumber, but it was not restorative. Her unconscious mind was besieged by terrors of asphyxiation, a primal dread that she was deprived of oxygen. When she finally emerged from sleep, the chamber was dim. A small illumination had been active when she arrived, but now it appeared to have extinguished. She reached for her media player to verify the hour, but the interface was void. She presumed the power had expired. As she scanned the hostel hallway, everything seemed eclipsed and monochromatic. She surmised it was 5 a.m., the sun yet to ascend above the horizon. She blundered toward the lavatory in the gloom, but in her bewilderment, she accidentally excluded herself from her quarters. She navigated to the reception counter to request a duplicate key. It was only then that the primary fissure in her reality emerged. It wasn't 5 a.m. It was midday. The lobby fixtures were luminous. Her iPod wasn't depleted. The screen was radiating. She simply couldn't perceive the luminescence. It wasn't the sun that had failed to ascend. It was the photons that had failed to reach her cognition. The hysteria was instantaneous. As she turned to retreat upstairs, her respiratory system constricted. She began panting for oxygen, a desperate, discordant sound. It was the sensation of having just completed a sprint, but the air wouldn't return. Ashley was asthmatic, and she questioned if this was her inaugural severe episode in years. She hyperventilated, her rib cage laboring, as she returned to the concierge. The employee, witnessing the girl's dilated, vacant pupils, handed her a paper sack and instructed her to respirate. But the bag offered no reprieve. The sensory void was encroaching. The receptionist transported her to an outpatient center, where a medical professional held up digits for Ashley to calculate. Ashley looked toward the hand, but there was nothing but a charcoal abyss. She couldn't distinguish a single finger. She was accelerated to the infirmary. The clinicians were candid. Had she been celebrating? Had she ingested narcotics? It wasn't until the hematology reports arrived that the enigma was unmasked. The elite beverage in Bali hadn't been concocted with ethanol, the substance humans can safely digest. It had been spiked with methanol. Methanol is a counterfeit substitute, frequently utilized in industrial degreasers or coolant. It is inexpensive, and in regions like Bali, it is occasionally utilized to inflate a venue's margins. But for the human anatomy, it is a terminal verdict. One gulp can be fatal. As methanol processes, it synthesizes formaldehyde. the agent used to preserve cadavers, and formic acid. These compounds mimic cyanide, halting energy synthesis in cells and assaulting the optic nerves. There were massive volumes of it in Ashley's bloodstream. The specialists were stunned she had regained consciousness at all. In a perverse irony of clinical science, the very toxin that had compromised her was now the sole element maintaining her heartbeat. To obstruct the methanol from finalizing its destruction, the practitioners had to intervene with a paradoxical antidote: ethanol. Because the metabolism prioritizes the degradation of ethanol, keeping a patient intoxicated on authentic alcohol can inhibit the liver from converting the residual methanol into corrosive acid. The physicians handed Ashley a synthetic cup brimming with vodka and citrus juice. She consumed it. They decanted another, and then another. She was participating in the most surreal drinking game of her life in the center of a medical pavilion. The more inebriated she became, the more she could breathe. The more her perspective seemed to fluctuate back to existence. But the intermission was fleeting. She was relocated to the intensive care unit for hemodialysis, a procedure that scrubbed the contaminant from her circulation. Her renal system was failing. Her central nervous network was under siege. The doctors contacted her mother, Carolina, in Canada. They instructed her to board a flight immediately. But they couldn't guarantee that Ashley would still be breathing when she touched down. The spirits had preserved her life. But as the haze of the clinical binge dissipated, a new, much bleaker reality anchored itself to her hospital mattress. The medical staff battled to salvage what remained. They administered high-potency corticosteroids to mitigate the inflammation in her optic fibers. For 1 week, there was a spark of optimism. Ashley could perceive pigments again. She could interpret the script of a manuscript. It felt like a phenomenon, a narrow evasion of a permanent eclipse. But the hope was a cruel deception. Gradually, the characters on the sheets began to vanish. The clarity softened, then liquefied. The clinicians eventually had to acknowledge the truth. They had depleted all strategies. The trauma to the nerves was too profound. The radiance was never returning. Ashley was occluded. She was 19 years old, thousands of miles from her origin, and her world had been compressed to a fraction of its former magnitude. She recalls weeping as she cataloged the nevers. She would never attend a university. She would never secure employment. She would never experience romance or operate a vehicle. She had aspired to be a performer. But how could a sightless girl stand on a platform? Her mother arrived, and they clung to one another and sobbed. For the subsequent weeks, Ashley resided in a New Zealand hotel, convalescing enough to travel. She had nothing but her media device. She audited the same 250 melodies repeatedly, the stanzas becoming her solitary topography. The most grueling aspect of entering a visual blackout wasn't the darkness. It was the dreams that persisted in high definition. Every night, she would dream in vivid, saturated hues, only to awaken and find the universe had been replaced by static. Returning to Calgary felt like attending her own internment. She was a phantom frequenting her former existence. She couldn't reside in her own quarters because her parents had leased them to an exchange student for the year. So she was consigned to the cellar. Her autonomy had been liquidated in a single night in Kuta. Her peers organized a trip to Mexico. But the summons never arrived for Ashley. She hypothesized they didn't desire the encumbrance of a disabled girl in their assembly. She became abrasive. She became resentful of the cosmos. She felt as if her destiny had been hijacked, and she was left with the invoice. Ashley characterizes her residual perspective as approximately 2%. She possesses no central focus, the anatomical region that manages precision, pigment, and depth. Instead, her reality is a granular blizzard. It resembles the interference on a vintage television monitor, all rendered in an ochre palette. In the beginning, she existed in total repudiation. She refused to employ a white staff. She refused to solicit assistance. She would attempt to encounter friends in lounges she knew by memory, calculating the strides and internalizing the architecture so she could simulate normalcy. She didn't want to be affiliated with the occluded collective. She was an ableist without recognizing it, detesting the impairment that had claimed her. But repudiation is a treacherous bulwark. One day, while attempting to pilot a familiar thoroughfare without aid, Ashley traversed the path at the incorrect juncture. She was struck by a vehicle. The collision was a savage reality check. She realized that she couldn't persist in the charade. She was injuring herself, and her resentment was a toxin just as lethal as the methanol. There is also a strange, minor fixation that took hold, her eyebrows. She became convinced they were overgrown and would spend hours grooming them in the sensory void. Because she couldn't perceive her actions, she ended up with quite eccentric brows, a small, humorous detail in an otherwise grim convalescence. She sought retribution, but there was none to be discovered. The establishment in Bali where she believed she was contaminated had dissolved. There would be no litigation, no compensation, and no apology. She had to concede that the world didn't owe her a restoration. She realized she had to cease being indignant if she wanted to actually exist. She had to learn to perceive with a different variety of internal light. The pivot commenced 2 years after the poisoning. Ashley determined she wouldn't let the 2% vantage point be her enclosure. She went globe-trotting through 7 nations in South America. She didn't just trek, she ascended volcanoes. She glided with sharks. She began to distribute her narrative with other voyagers, alerting them about the perils of illicit spirits. She realized that blindness was often an imperceptible disability. Because she didn't conform to the archetype of the dark glasses and a cane, people frequently doubted her. She had to learn to negotiate a world that wasn't constructed for her, utilizing a smartphone to amplify documents and a handheld scanner for the remainder. She eventually journeyed to India. Originally, her incentive was an aspiration for stem cell innovation that might reinstate her sight. But once she arrived, she felt a strange hesitation. She realized she was terrified to lose the 2% of clarity she had left. That minute sliver of perception had granted her a life she never deemed achievable. In India, she met individuals who appreciated her for who she was now, not who she had been prior to the cocktail. She realized her essence wasn't tethered to her optic nerves. After returning, she chased a career in journalism and accepted an internship at a periodical. Her editor requested her to document a theater troupe that produced performances accessible for the impaired. During a production, Ashley was invited onto the stage to engage in a scene. She missed a visual signal to grasp an actor's hand, and only then did she disclose her condition. It transpired that one of the professional thespians on stage was also sightless. When the performance concluded, the congregation rose in a standing ovation. It was the most captivating moment of her life. The founders of that organization became her guides. Ashley finally achieved what her 19-year-old self deemed impossible. She enrolled in drama conservatory. She began to audition. She even composed a memoir for the stage entitled Static, transforming her trauma into aesthetic expression. The world didn't become more accessible. Ashley simply became more resilient. 14 years have elapsed since that night in Kuta. Today, Ashley King leads a life that contradicts the nevers she documented in that New Zealand medical center. She glides down mountains on a snowboard, following the resonance of her partner's voice as he provides navigation. She has sandboarded in the dunes of Morocco. She has explored, she has educated herself, and she has discovered affection. She still dreams in color, and she still awakens to the interference. But the staggering truth is that the 2% of perception she was left with provided her 100% of the existence she desired. Loss of sight taught her that you truly have no comprehension of what someone is enduring. She doesn't want to be viewed as a phenomenon or a radiant inspiration. She is, in her own vocabulary, as flawed and inconsistent as anyone else. She just happens to be performing tasks that are a slightly greater challenge. The survival tariff she paid in Indonesia was steep, but the individual she became in the transition is someone the 19-year-old Ashley would barely acknowledge. She demonstrated that while the surroundings might seize your sight, they cannot confiscate your vision. She is inhabiting the life she always imagined, one step in front of the other, through the amber-tinted snowfall of her world.